Memoirs of Ronald Reagan have been published. The book is called An American Life, and the title is strangely credible. Initially, one resists the idea that a young man from Dixon, Illinois, brought up in modest circumstances, who became a sportscaster and after that a movie actor, a lecturer on the General Electric circuit, the governor of California, president of the United States, who after his first term was sent back to the White House for a second term, carrying more states than Roosevelt did against Landon, is in any workaday sense merely an American life. But at no point in this 700-page book does the reader find himself dealing other than with a man whose values are distinctively American. Ronald Reagan's experiences are rooted in the American way, and his career could not have been shaped other than in America. As we read about his experiences in Hollywood, on the speaking circuit, in the Goldwater campaign, responding to the sudden draft by close friends to enter politics, learning while taking a shower that he had been elected 40th President of the United States, confronting in Washington crises brought on by the Soviet Union, the stock market, Congress, Israel, Nicaragua, Lebanon, terrorists, the book absorbs the reader in the developing portrait of an American life. The book is full of intimate glimpses, riding through Windsor Park with the Queen of England, saying hello to the Pope in Alaska, urging Gorbachev to just call him Ron. Yet it is the closest we are likely to get to the history of the 1980s in America, and the closest we will ever get to a portrait of someone who feels it unnatural to draw open the curtain on his private life, and yet succeeds in illuminating that life by giving his reactions to public situations that give him pain and pleasure. Since the first few years of his presidency, Mr. Reagan was criticized primarily because of his association with what they call Reaganomics. I thought to explore what he says in his book on that subject. Accordingly, my first question, how do you define Reaganomics?
Well, I did have some very firm beliefs. First of all, I spent 4 years getting a degree in economics in college. And later, I maybe should confess that the college brought me back 25 years later and gave me an honorary degree. And that compounded a sense of guilt because I always figured the first one was honorary. But no, I had a very strong belief that, and based some on actual history of this country, that tax cuts, for example, very often, if not always, resulted in more money for the government rather than less. And thinking of this goes clear back in my studies to a man named Ibn Khaldun in Egypt. And Ibn Khaldun said at the beginning of the empire, the rates were low, but the revenue was great. At the end of the empire, the rates were great, but the revenue was low. And so this economic program that we put into effect, incidentally, I knew it was succeeding when they stopped calling it Reaganomics. But a lot of this was based on, and I believe that, well, I'm leaving out a line. The fact is that for 8 years we had the longest and biggest economic recovery and economic growth in our entire history.
Why did you run into opposition to it, given the fact that Jack Kennedy, for instance, had specifically endorsed a sharp reduction in taxes, which were in fact undertaken after he was assassinated under Lyndon Johnson? How do you account for the opposition that you did have? Was it simply people who hadn't majored in economics?
I think so. But also, frankly, the opposing party has always been the party of wanting more revenues. And
but you just finished pointing out that they, in fact, get more revenues with lower taxes.
They somehow, they refuse to believe it. But if you look back at when Coolidge handled the World War I debt, the same thing took place. He was one who believed that if you lessen the share of the person's earnings that the government takes, the person is not going to be as ambitious as he might be. I remembered from my own days in pictures. In pictures, it was very easy to get into the top bracket. And once you got there, in the top bracket,
you didn't earn any money.
the top bracket, I remember, was 94% at one time. Well, you could have offered me the greatest picture in the world, and I wouldn't have done it. Once I got there, who's going to work for 6 cents on the dollar? And
well, you don't explain in your book why in 1981, when that first act went through, you consented to cutting that 10% down to 5% the first year, which some people think was a responsible cause for the depth of the recession in 1982.
well, we had a great problem with, frankly, a hostile Congress. All the time I was president, the House of Representatives was majority Democratic, and they were opposed to very much of what I wanted to do. So sometimes you had to compromise, and instead of having it come instantly, why, we stretched it out so over a few years. Some of these taxes or tax cuts took effect. As a matter of fact, in the first few years of the income tax cuts, the revenue increased $375 billion, but the Congress increased spending $450. Yes. Well, the last election, congressional election, 98% of the incumbents were returned to office.
Yeah, I calculated a few years ago that the incumbency rate in the House of Representatives exceeds that in the House of Lords. You can use that in your next book.